Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Adam here, and welcome to my American Presidential Library series. I am currently in my hometown of Chicago, Illinois, and behind me is the future site of President Barack Obama's Presidential Library. This site, which at the time I'm recording this, is set to open sometime later next year in 2025, so obviously that could kind of change. But I thought, in anticipation of this happening, it would be fun to go to all the previously existing presidential libraries, of which there are 13. This will be the 14th. We will do them in continuity order by seniority of president, and we'll just talk all about them. They are kind of a rare thing, kind of spaced throughout the country, and as this series goes, you'll learn more and more about each one of these presidents. Our Presidential Libraries tour continues here in Boston, Massachusetts, with the 5th Presidential Library, that of the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. This is Megalink. He was cool enough to bring me out here. So we are going to learn all about the 35th President of the United States. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of people asking about the assassination stuff. I actually did an entire deep dive video on that. You can watch that. I'm sure we'll talk about it at least, a little bit in here. This is actually unique amongst the presidential libraries for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, John F. Kennedy had nothing to do with it, as it was built far after his death. And two, he's actually one of only a handful of presidents not buried at his own library. He's, of course, buried in Arlington. That said, it made sense for it to be in Boston, given his family's history. And I didn't even recognize, Boston. I didn't even recognize this originally. This is part of like an entire Kennedy complex. Like Ted Kennedy's building is over there. Can't forget this, of course. This is my presidential passport, and it's time to get stamped for John F. Kennedy. Once you are inside, there is security, which is no problem at all. You go over here to buy your tickets, and you head on in. This one's kind of cool because it's actually built right on the waterfront. You can actually see aircraft coming in to land over there. This is the first of the presidential libraries intentionally built in a major city that the president wasn't necessarily from. At least, I mean, he was obviously from this area, but more like Hyannisport, not Boston specifically. This would become more of a tradition with presidential libraries, as it just made more financial sense for people to have libraries accessible in major cities. I've got my stamp and a little sticker. We chose to go to the moon. So once you enter, you'll obviously see the sign for the museum entrance, and they're going to talk about young Jack Kennedy. When he was a child, he was born the second of many brothers, had an older brother, famously named Joseph Kennedy, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. Here it looks like they have a movie and stuff. I don't know if we're going to have anything to do with that, but basically, yeah, he's just a kid, and he's born with actually a slight oddity in his physique. One of his legs was slightly shorter than the other. That would lead to chronic back pain over time. Actually, that contributed to his own death because he had to wear a permanent back brace, and so on November 22nd, 1963, when he was shot, he couldn't quite lean over properly because of the back brace, hence, yes. Anyway, the Harvard years, he obviously goes to Harvard here in Boston. Graduates from there. Not a great student, actually, and a lot of his teachers basically said, like, he was clearly a smart guy, but he had a lot of potential, but he wasn't trying that hard, and largely he responded by saying, why do I have to try? Joseph, his older brother, had already done everything. Picture of his family. So that's John F. Kennedy. This is Joseph Kennedy. This is his father, who would become an ambassador to England, which I'm sure we'll talk about. There's Ted Kennedy. I'm pretty sure it's Bobby Kennedy, along with his mother and his sisters there. And so he goes to Europe because his dad is an ambassador for the UK, and he actually develops an interest. Even though he wasn't the best student, he had developed an interest in geopolitics, and he wanted to see what was going on in Europe. And because his dad happened to be the ambassador for the UK under the Roosevelt administration, he sent JFK over there. He studies abroad in 1939. He's actually in Europe when World War II starts, and he manages to get out of there before having any issues. But once he gets back, he writes this book, Why England Slept, which was a book largely about the fact that the UK was simply not prepared for the war and why it hadn't done that. It was kind of a warning to the United States saying, like, these guys are bad. It's getting bad. We got to be ready. But the point of this was to basically establish this young man, John F. Kennedy, was a political genius and was ready for a bigger stage. Although there's many a rumor out there that most of the copies were actually bought by his father, but all the same, yeah. So they talk about some of that stuff. He serves in World War II. I forget the name of the incident. He serves in the Japanese campaign. Oh yeah, here it is. August 2nd, 1943. His boat is attacked by the Japanese, and it's sunk. And it was PT-109. Okay, that's significant. So PT-109 is destroyed by the Japanese, and JFK survives. He manages to basically take a bunch of American soldiers and bring them aboard an island. Like, he just kind of swims, even though he was wounded in horrible shape, he was able to successfully save the lives of a lot of American sailors. This got him a lot of PR as a war hero, and it would actually lead to eventual tragedy. They have imagery of that. This actually was, fun fact, was made into a movie called PT-109 while Kennedy was president. And he was actually a producer of the film. He read the script, he approved it, he even was involved with casting, making him the only sitting president in history to be directly involved in a theatrical film about himself, or any production whatsoever. But anyway, so that would be later. So his brother, though, Joseph Kennedy. So when he gets back, he's considered like this big war hero. He did all this stuff. Joseph Kennedy, who was kind of the older brother, who was supposed to be the bigger brother and all that sort of stuff, he felt he needed to prove something because Jack had been this hero, or John Kennedy was known as Jack. So he goes out and he volunteers for this extremely dangerous mission where he was flying a bomber, essentially, loaded with all sorts of explosives. Unfortunately for him and for everybody in that family, it was destroyed, he died, and then John F. Kennedy was set up as now the oldest brother of the Kennedy family. These are just some crutches from his chronic back pain, which we talked about before. That's very interesting to see. Anyway, this looks like they have a movie or something in here. He's just been sitting here quietly listening to me ramble. But anyway, they have a movie sitting in here, and then I think in proud presidential library tradition, we're probably not going to watch that. We're just going to move on. You actually are going to go straight down a staircase. Are you excited about going down a staircase?
I already went to the bathroom down here, so I already know what's up.
Well, hopefully you flushed. You'll see this picture of Kennedy, and then turn in here, and they have a movie. You're greeted by this. This is the section that's basically about the 1960 election. So Kennedy was an interesting case because he was running for president kind of against his will. He actually didn't really want to be president. There is, of course, this old story about how his father, Joseph Kennedy, wanted to put one of his sons in the White House. Joe Kennedy, the oldest brother, was meant for that position. Everybody kind of agreed on it, but Jack Kennedy kind of fell into it. To be fair, though, it wasn't just like his dad made him do it. That wouldn't be correct to say. But his dad did pressure him a bit, and he felt he owed it to his brother, and etc. So he's a very charismatic person, but the presidency was kind of crafted around him. He, of course, ends up with Jackie Onassis, which I'm sure we'll see more of later. But it's weird from a structure standpoint. They just jump from early life straight to the election, but whatever. So yeah, he ends up getting the nomination in 1960, largely running on a platform of anti-communism and wanting to close the gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, which interestingly, he knew full well was not real. He would constantly go out there and basically, I'm just going to be honest, he would lie and say that the United States had fallen way behind the Soviet Union in nuclear weapons and technology, which wasn't actually true. So much so that President Eisenhower, who was sitting president at the time, actually brings him to the White House, sits him down and says, like, here's everything that's actually happening. Kennedy reportedly responds to him, oh, I know the truth, but he was a populist, so he was just telling people what they wanted to hear about how he was going to fix a problem that didn't even exist. That would come back to bite him because he would basically be this guy who ran on a platform of I will destroy communism, and we'll get to the Cuban stuff later. But regardless, 1960, he gets the nomination, and it is officially the Kennedy-Johnson ticket. Future President Lyndon Johnson, not somebody that really got along with Kennedy, especially his brother Bobby Kennedy, but he was considered politically necessary for the presidency, as he would likely bring Texas. He is also, fun fact, the last time a vice president's being on the ticket actually had a consequential impact on the election itself. So when you leave that area, they have this thing about Smith's Home Electronics. This is clearly trying to give you the vibe of what the country looked like in the 1960s, as well as this side, which just has a bunch of displayed items, Game of Life, all these cool little museum bits. Again, I think what they're going for here is the vibe of the 1960s. And, when they elect Kennedy, he wins. We'll talk about that. Jack, walk in. Yeah, campaign headquarters, Detroit for Kennedy. They're basically just talking about the Kennedy election in general, which I think is pretty cool. It is funny though, one thing about JFK that famously he was really unknown to the public. He had been a congressman very briefly for Massachusetts, not a particularly accomplished one. He achieves the Senate seat as his father had largely pushed the incumbent senator out for him. and he gets that. He becomes a little bit more accomplished, but nationally, he really wasn't known. If you ever watch Back to the Future, have you ever seen Back to the Future?
I have.
Okay. Yes, good. So you'll remember when Marty gets to Lorraine's parents' house, he says, do you know where 123 Riverside Drive is? And he's like, other side of town, block past Maple. Block past Maple, that's John F. Kennedy Drive. Who the hell is John F. Kennedy? That was 1955. This dude is president only 5 years later. Nobody knew who he was nationally.
I did not realize that back in the day, you had to be 21 to vote rather than 18.
And then we get into the Kennedy-Nixon debate, probably the single most famous one-sided debate in the history of politics. It was also the first televised debate. Richard Nixon had been the sitting vice president at the time. And if you watch this debate, it's actually fascinating to watch. Kennedy, his parents, his dad in particular, had a lot of Hollywood people involved. They understood the power of the camera, so they put makeup on him, they did proper lighting on him, they knew how to make him look good on TV. But if you look at Nixon, people did not know, his people didn't know any of that. This is the first televised debate, and they didn't understand the power of it. So Nixon looks confused, and he looks sweating, he looks nervous, whereas Kennedy looks calm and reserved. And despite the image that Kennedy has as like one of the youngest presidents ever, he actually wasn't that much younger than Richard Nixon. He just looks much younger because of how they handled it. So yeah, it's this debate, when people were, reviewing it at the time, everybody who watched it said, oh, JFK won, because he came out looking calm and natural and presentable. But people who listened to the radio thought Richard Nixon had won because what he was actually saying was a tad more, normal. Not normal, but maybe his policy came off a little better. So it just basically presented the power of television in a way that we had never seen in the presidency before.
Just Gen Z mindset, but I feel like they just got done making out the way how they look on that cover.
So here's me just trying to get some B-roll, and he just makes a joke I have to include in the video.
Of course. Just couldn't help myself,
So when you leave the area that shows footage of debate, they have a little setup here for the election night itself. This is considered the closest election in American history, at least modern American history. And Richard Nixon barely loses. He would actually hold kind of hold that against Kennedy for years, believing that the election had basically been stolen from him. And there's a lot of evidence to think that might have been, at least in part, that there was a lot of ballot stuffing in Illinois and Texas specifically that barely got Kennedy over the hump. I don't know if that's ever been proven exactly, but either way, we ultimately would see what a Nixon presidency looks like. So it's not like the guy never had his chance. Yeah, see, look at the difference in the popular vote total. About 100,000 votes is all that separated them. So Kennedy ends up winning. But a lot of people think that Texas was mostly just brought in because of Lyndon Johnson. That I agree with. And that Marconi, I think was his name, or Garconi, one of the Chicago mob guys working with Kennedy's father, probably stuffed the ballots to get Kennedy, Illinois. So shout out from my state. I want it to be very clear. I am glad Kennedy won. But as I said, Nixon would get his time in the White House, and we all kind of know how that went. So when you leave that area, they've got more of this stuff, and ultimately they have his victory speech. This is a very famous, one of the most famous inauguration speeches. It's the one that has that line, of course, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's my Kennedy, sorry. But yeah, they have that set up over there. They play the whole thing, and they have it all written out here for you, along with the crowds. His inauguration is actually interesting for a lot of reasons. So at the time, this is him right here. This is Dwight Eisenhower, who was the outgoing president. I don't know exactly where he is. I think this is him. I think that's Harry Truman. So he was the only other former president besides Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was still alive. He would actually outlive Kennedy, as it turns out. He had attempted to get to D.C. for the inauguration, but you can kind of see there's snow and stuff back there, and everybody's bundled up. It was a super snowy day. The weather was really bad. It was super cold, and Hoover's flight was canceled. He could not get to the inauguration. Interestingly, Lyndon Johnson, who would become the next president, the 36th president, is there, as is Richard Nixon, who would become the 37th president. So in this photo, without realizing it, you have 5 different American presidents. Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, and I think one of those two, or maybe that's one, Harry Truman. But I know Harry Truman's there. I'm just not sure which one he is. I did just want to give a shout out to Herbert Hoover, though. Like, he should have been there. He just couldn't. Once you leave that area, you get into this. This is, of course, the presidency, his actual time in office. Now, of course, because of obvious circumstances about how his presidency ends on November 22nd, 1963, JFK had actually had a pretty short time in office. He was really only president for about 2.5 years. But this is from the inauguration ball and all that sort of stuff. So this section covers kind of a few different things. One, I'll just kind of get out of the way. It largely talks about his ability to talk to the press. It has been often said that JFK's interaction with the press was seen more as a stand-up comedy routine, where any sort of serious question, he would try to make a joke about it. He was always just kind of planning a comedy line in response to everything. For example, they showed one about term limits for congressmen, and he said that, they were like, former President Eisenhower has suggested term limits not only on the presidency, but congressmen, and he said something to the effect of like, well, I would love to agree with that, and I'll talk more about it once I, too, am a former president. In other words, he didn't want to take it up at the time. That's just a funnies. But this is about the state of the world. So, here's the big stuff. Cold War, obviously. Basically, at the time of the Eisenhower administration, post-World War II, everything was kind of solidifying into what the new shape of the world was. The United States and its allies versus the Soviet Union and its allies, and the political disagreements they had on, communism versus capitalism, etc. And so Eisenhower had done a very good job of kind of establishing the United States' foothold in Europe to basically keep, the Soviet Union out of there. The basic belief was the United States' security depended on the fact that nobody could really get to it. Most of the countries within our region are pacifist or harmless or allies. So any real threat really only comes from the other parts of the world. If the United States has a permanent presence in Europe and the United States has a permanent presence in Asia, then our enemies cannot get to us. That is the foundation of American security. The foundation of Soviet, or now Russian, security was if we basically control a whole bunch of outer points and our population stays within our center, as long as we control all these nodes of entry, then we are safe. The problem is those two concepts cannot coexist. One must be successful for the other to fail. They cannot both succeed, because the Russians would have to take control of Europe to feel safe, which would make the Americans not feel safe, et cetera, et cetera. So Eisenhower felt NATO was very important and he had to stay there. He becomes the first head of NATO, as we've talked about in his video. Now, at the end of World War II, the United States is still in Berlin, because Berlin falls in East Germany. The country was split up into 4 zones originally. The French, British, and American zones unify under what is called West Germany. And so everything west of that point is still the West, as we now define it. The American Allied zone, everything east of it is the Soviet zone, along with their allies, which was mostly countries forced at gunpoint to agree with them. But then Berlin itself, which was in the middle of it, was split up as well. And there was never really a clean agreement on what to do with it. The Soviets couldn't necessarily just kick us out of it, but we couldn't really expand beyond it, so it just kind of sat as a bastion of freedom in the middle of a communist country, which they really didn't like. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, things are starting to get bad. So in Vietnam, communism is starting to come up on the rise. Obviously in Cuba, we'll talk about that too, comes up on the rise. One thing to really understand the political ideology differences between communism and capitalism. Capitalism, if we're going to use Star Wars here, capitalism is like being a Jedi. It's much harder. It's difficult. It requires more patience, more focus, more attention. But the rewards are far long lasting. Communism is more tempting. It's the dark side. It seems good on paper because, the state will just solve all my problems. But that never works out. And they're even illustrated as red because, like red lightsabers like the Sith. But anyway, so the United States' fear under the Eisenhower years was basically that communism would lead to what's called the domino effect, where like one country falls and then other ones fall and fall and fall and fall. And we had been seeing a lot of countries fall. We got stuck in the Korean War until Eisenhower got us out of it under the same thing. It looked like we were getting into Vietnam early over this. What really tips everything, though, is the Cuba situation. So the Fidel Castro regime comes to power in the 1950s, and Eisenhower basically says we can't have a communist state like this close to us because it could theoretically lead to the tipping over of all these other parts of the Caribbean. One part that people don't talk about much is from before World War II, there was only 3 options in the world. You were either an imperial country like the UK and the British Empire, you were a conquered country like Canada was still a British colony at the time, or you were a freak of nature where you were just a country that somehow managed to be neither. Very few of those. You'd have like Bhutan, Thailand was managed to stay out, and oddly enough, the United States. The United States was neither a colonizer nor a colony. But that's partially why it was very well insulated at the end of the war. So when colonialism was ending and being destroyed and dismantled in the 1940s and 1950s, a lot of the Caribbean countries, a lot of these former colonies in Africa, parts of Europe, parts of Southeast Asia, communism was very tempting because it was just like, oh, we don't have to do much. Our government will take care of everything. And we were trying to enforce like, no, you want to be a capitalist. It takes more work, but it turns out better for you in the long run. Then that's how you get the Cuba thing. So once that falls, the Eisenhower administration is trying to figure out what to do about it, how to politically deal with it. They were willing to tolerate it for a little bit. They even invited Fidel up to D.C. He did a diplomatic mission. They were kind of ready to recognize and everything. But then Fidel goes a little too far. He makes a deal with the Soviet Union to have Soviet oil refined in Cuba. Now, originally, it was all American, British, and I think Dutch companies in Cuba that were refining oil. They refused to do stuff for the Soviet Union. So once they refused to do that, the communist government, they basically just stole all the Western assets in Cuba. This really upset the United States in particular, and that became the beginning of tensions, to the point where the Eisenhower administration realized Castro and the communist government had to go, and this was the early foundation of the Bay of Pigs, but we'll get back to that. So this section is on the space race and all that. Kennedy was obviously a big proponent of it. In his inauguration, he's talking about it. He, of course, makes that famous speech about we're going to get a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which, of course, they did. He wouldn't live to see it, but that was a big part of the Kennedy administration's goals, was to have the U.S. be second to none in the space race. And while it was partially based on the pride element, you got to remember the technology of the time and the goals. It was partially to one up the Soviet Union to look good, but also the other things came of that. I mean, the space race largely led to a lot of modern technology, because when you're developing all sorts of this stuff, a lot of it gets passed on to other industries and sold out to other fields. Things like your phone and stuff like that were born of this kind of endeavor. So there was a lot more to it, but technological advancement was just one of them for the purposes of peace and science, but also, frankly, of war. You can't fall behind your geopolitical foe when they were launching things like Sputnik into the air, into the atmosphere, and you couldn't compete. So that's why they said the only thing the United States could really do to one-up the Soviet Union in that regard was to actually land a man on the moon. I mean, yeah, there was a lot when it comes to the space race and how important it was to the United States, and a lot of goals to be achieved, the sciences, the technologies. It wasn't just bragging rights. There's a lot more to it than that. So this statue here was given to John F. Kennedy by Pope Paul VI. Kennedy, I know he was the first Catholic ever in the White House. I'm not a religious person, so I don't really know. Is the Pope Catholic? I think he is. I think that's the whole joke. So this room is it's specifically about the Peace Corps. Now, the Peace Corps was one of the only major accomplishments of Kennedy's first year in office. In that time, he was able to raise the minimum wage. He was able to expand Social Security benefits. But outside of that, he mostly saw his first year in office as almost pointless and kind of a failure. One thing he did through executive action was the Peace Corps. Peace Corps was a group of people from the United States that could go around the world on diplomatic missions to basically encourage peace and do things for the betterment of other people around the world, show them how to do labor and other things to benefit their lives. It was kind of a great way to spread democracy and give people an alternative to communism without it being a direct kind of military intervention or a threat to local societies. And they kind of saw, this is what the United States is about? All right, I'm kind of on board. And that was considered one of the most legislative, it wasn't even technically legislative, but one of the most major public achievements of the Kennedy White House. And it is still around to this day. So here is a gift that he received. It's a medallion. It basically talks about Kennedy's attempt to keep communism out of Latin America. Again, we wanted it nowhere near our region. So he basically did a bunch of diplomatic missions and efforts to basically help Latin America get more onto its feet. And this is just kind of celebrating it. So this section is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This story is so complex and convoluted, they don't even try to present it. They have a movie about it. So basically, I'm going to truncate this for you. What you need to know is that we had mentioned before, there was a thing called the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was something developed under the Eisenhower administration, but that Kennedy decided to continue to do. However, he changed it. The original idea was they wanted Castro out of power, but they couldn't just directly invade Cuba because they were afraid if they did, that would obviously, upset the Soviet Union. And if they did that to what was kind of a quasi-ally, at the time, Cuba was just kind of friendly with the Soviet Union. It wasn't any sort of formal ally or anything. It would eventually become kind of a satellite state, but at the time it was just friendly. And they thought, and rightly so, if the United States just full force just invaded Cuba, there would be nothing stopping the Soviet Union from just full force invading and taking over Berlin. So they had to kind of play to that. At the same time, though, it was getting more difficult down there, and they were afraid of, communism spreading in the region, and they didn't know, what was going to come of that. So Kennedy, who had run on a platform of, just standing up to communism, couldn't just let this stand. He had to do something. Bay of Pigs was already set in place, but the original plan was basically train a bunch of people, Cuban expats, Nicaraguans, freedom fighters, what have you, give them a bunch of assets, and they would come up from Nicaragua, and they were supposed to attack an area known as Trinidad instead of the Bay of Pigs. And once they got there, the idea was that they would set up a strong foothold against Castro's government. They would get recognized immediately by the United States government. And then if they asked for diplomatic intervention, the United States could say, hey, we have to protect our assets in Guantanamo Bay, which to this day is still a U.S. naval base. And then Cuba could then fight to take over away from the Castro regime. However, doing so did come with a lot of diplomatic risk, because if anything went wrong with that particular plan of landing in Trinidad, then the United States would kind of be caught with their, tail in the wind, as it were. And so Kennedy wanted plausible deniability, which meant much less support and switching them over to the Bay of Pigs, which is an area, I think it's right there actually. And in doing so, they went in and they were completely demolished. It was like 1,500 troops versus the Cuban army, because they were also largely, in both scenarios, were dependent upon the idea that the Cuban locals would stand up. The problem was the Cubans actually liked Castro, so that really wasn't going to work. Since the beginning of the American Republic, the goal has always been, since George Washington all the way till Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all European military assets must leave the American hemisphere. That was basically the basis of the Monroe Doctrine, which was everybody out. And over the course of time, we did that. There's the American Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase, obviously the Spanish-American War, buying Alaska from the Soviet Union, or the Russians at the time, more accurately. Things like buying the U.S. Virgin Islands away from the Dutch. That goal was not completed until World War II, when FDR cuts a deal with the British, part of the Lend-Lease program, to get all British naval and military assets out of the Americas. That was the first time we were totally secure. Then comes the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union, a technically European power, decides to set up shop right here. That was the foundation of what upset the United States so much. It's an overly paranoid society, and justifiably so in that case, because on top of also having nuclear weapons aimed at us within our backyard in our region, the United States has what I would call OP, overpowered geography. It's almost impossible to invade. Even though you can't really see it, there are thin strips of land here that makes landing a beachhead almost impossible. It's overly defended. Its geography is insane. It does have one weakness, which is everything must kind of flow through New Orleans to get through our navigable riverways. The entire interior is accessible from right there, meaning all trade has to go in and out of it. But if you look at the Caribbean, you'll see a lot of land blocks it. Cuba, more so than anything, blocks us and could cut us off from the Gulf of Mexico into the wider Atlantic and ultimately the wider world oceans. So the idea of a Soviet presence around Cuba could have theoretically meant blocking us in. That caused, let's say, a lot of tension. So the Bay of Pigs completely fails, and that's in 1960. It's only a few months into Kennedy's presidency. Then you have to fast forward to 1962, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is where everything kind of comes to a head. Even though Kennedy had constantly been out there telling everybody the United States was behind in all these technologies, the United States actually was way ahead, not only in that, but in nuclear armaments. The United States didn't really have anything to fear from the Soviets directly, but the public relations side of it basically suggested that we did. The Soviets had started to accept that they actually were badly losing this, and they needed to do something to put the U.S. in check in their minds. Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the premier of the Soviet Union, taking over after Stalin, looked at a map and said, what are we going to do? We have to do something, but we don't have any land in that part of the world. The United States has the unfair advantage that it has Alaska, so it can reach this side. Granted, obviously, they could reach Alaska, but to this day, the Russians have never really developed this area. And then in Europe, there's a whole bunch of allies. The Soviet Union had no allies anywhere near the United States. Then, of course, comes in Cuba. So they basically went to Cuba and said, let's cut a deal, let's dance. And initially, Castro is not all that on board because he doesn't really want all this attention brought to him. But then he kind of realizes there were a lot of benefits to being allied with the Soviet Union, particularly when you believe the United States in a post-Bay of Pigs invasion. He believed, yeah, they're probably going to come for me at some point, so it'd be good to have this. So what eventually happens is the Soviet Union decides to bring nuclear weapons into Cuba for the purposes of being able to strategically launch them. This was considered, let's just say, stupid. And for 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union were like on the brink of nuclear war, where both of them had geopolitical reasons they could not take certain actions. And any small thing could have led to the complete destruction of the entire world. One particular example, there was actually a nuclear sub, a Soviet sub, around Cuba at the time, and it had actually submerged. The United States tries to get it to come to the surface, so they're dropping like little depth charges, non-violent depth charges that are basically just like pings that are just supposed to get your attention. The Soviets didn't know that's what they were, so they actually thought, oh, they're trying to bomb us. And so they had two people on board, which was standard protocol, that are in charge of firing a nuclear weapon. You have to get both of them to sign off on it, and both of them said, yes, fire the nuclear weapon. By sheer coincidence, there was a third guy on board who was like I'm going to call him the equivalency of like the Admiral of the Navy, who just happened to override both of them and said, no, let's not just fire a nuclear weapon, I want confirmation. They eventually surface and talk to Moscow and find out everything's fine. But had that one guy not been on the ship, there would have been nuclear war right then and there. That's just one of the many times this almost went down. There was an American plane shot down over Cuba. There was constant disconnections and things that people thought, oh, maybe something's already going on. It was a hyper tense moment. It was bad. It was very, very bad. Kennedy does not want to destroy the world. The Soviet Union doesn't want to destroy the world. Nikita Khrushchev does not. Castro, funny enough, does. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, these two guys are they have to do the domestic thing of looking strong, looking tough, and standing up to their geopolitical opponent while also finding a way to simmer stuff down. Each of them is struggling through that. Kennedy would famously say things like, he's trying to look at it through Khrushchev's perspective and see, like, what does he want? What is he trying to do? How can we negotiate? How can we work this out? The problem is Khrushchev really underestimated American paranoia. From their perspective, the Soviets were used to war. They were used to the brutality of it. They were used to being surrounded by their opponents. The United States has never been used to that. It still isn't. And so while the Soviet Union can kind of tolerate that, the United States cannot. It's not baked into the math of how we work as a people. And so that made the tensions go really high. Now, what ends up happening is Castro actually believes so certainly that the invasion of Cuba is imminent, which it almost was, that he actually tells Khrushchev, just go ahead and start firing nukes, destroy America. I don't even care if the response is the destruction of Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. And Khrushchev realizes he's kind of signed on with a crazy person. So what ends up happening is Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy. They were communicating with each other. He basically sends him two versions of a letter, both of which have to do with terms of removing missiles and all this sort of stuff. Kennedy famously agrees to the first letter, kind of ignores the second one. He has Bobby Kennedy, his brother, go to one of the Russian diplomats, the Soviet diplomats, and say, like, let's talk through some back channels here. And so basically an agreement was made that it had to look different than it actually was. The agreement was the Soviet Union would remove all nuclear weapons and missiles and everything out of Cuba. The United States would agree not to invade Cuba and to essentially just tolerate it. That's where eventually the blockade, or what was originally called a quarantine, would come in. And eventually, about 6 months later, the United States would remove missiles it had in Turkey. The missiles it had in Turkey were actually archaically old and basically of no real danger. The genuine fear at the time was the reason the United States had been putting missiles and defenses within Italy and Turkey and these other countries was they were all NATO members, and the general consensus amongst our NATO allies was, we don't really trust you to come to our defense, especially when you're willing to trade away our security for your own. That was one of the big problems with the Cuban Missile Crisis, is in order to make a straight up trade, you were basically saying, you're almost like negotiating with a terrorist. If the Soviet Union can come over to say, we're going to ally with Cuba in order to make us leave it, which we weren't even in originally, you have to give up on one of your allies. That was the diplomatic, geopolitical stress of this whole situation. This is the closest the entire world ever came to complete and total destruction And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. However, it is interesting, actually, because Khrushchev and Kennedy, fortunately, had met before this, and they had actually gotten along well enough. Khrushchev didn't want to destroy the world. Kennedy didn't want to destroy the world. The only one who did was Castro, because he's a nutcase, or he was. But anyway, this did cost them a lot, both of them. In a sense, the United States won because it ended up looking better for it, and the Soviet Union had, globally anyway, looked like the aggressor in the situation, as they had caused the problem to begin with, and they were the ones who had almost dropped nuclear weapons on the world. However, it's interesting because Kennedy comes out of this whole thing basically saying, you know, maybe we should rethink our relationship with the Soviet Union, because this was ridiculous, like how much how close we came to destroying the world. And he actually offers to get the Soviet Union involved in the space race and say, like, let's work together and everything like that. Khrushchev turns that down. They continue to tolerate each other. Khrushchev, apparently, according to his daughter, who is still around today, she apparently now says, she's been saying for years, that Khrushchev had actually changed his mind in 1963. He had decided he wanted to have a better relationship with the United States, and had actually agreed to Kennedy's idea of working together on space exploration. And he was going to tell Kennedy this, but then the Kennedy assassination occurs, and he didn't trust Lyndon Johnson at all, so he never ended up talking about it. Khrushchev would also be ultimately ousted from power, I think, only in like 1964, and he largely blamed his removal on his decision over going to the whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing, because the whole thing had actually been his idea. Had he not tried to just, inject nuclear weapons into Cuba, none of this would have ever happened, and it cost him the premiership, and he would be eventually replaced by Brezhnev. Castro, though, would end up living a really long time. I think he was in charge of Cuba all the way until like 2003 or something like that. It was a while. He was around. To this day, the United States still has diplomatic tension with Cuba over this, although that's been very much getting watered down. The Obama administration made normalized relations with them. I've actually been to Cuba. It's getting better down there, and in the coming years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba hasn't really had a lot of allies to work with, and so I'm calling it now, even though it's not necessarily relevant to this video. Cuba will come around to the, shall we say, American family probably within the next 10, 20 years. There's a lot of things about the Cuban Missile Crisis that are fascinating, but part of the reason we have such a good understanding of it is you'll see these photos with these old meetings and everything. Kennedy had actually set up a taping system in the White House where he was just kind of recording everything. So as a result, that's why we have so much information on the day-to-day events of those 13 days. Even more fascinating is technically 4 American presidents worked on this. Obviously JFK, but JFK also contacted former President Dwight Eisenhower, which he would call General. There's a famous phone call of the two of them talking about this. Eisenhower was even brought out to Camp David during the whole thing, which is like a presidential retreat, and they were talking plans, and he was also just kind of venting about the frustration of all of this. Some of that was Bay of Pigs, but basically Dwight Eisenhower was involved in his opinion. He also obviously consulted Lyndon Johnson, who was going to be president after him, and famously, somewhat famously, Richard Nixon actually was in town during this at one point, and he was actually requested to come in and talk to Kennedy, and he gave, Nixon gave Kennedy advice on what he suggested to do. Nixon's suggestion was more or less, the tensions around Cuba. He thought that you could basically do a legal way of attacking Cuba was to say we're protecting Guantanamo Bay from the threat that is communism, and you kind of attack from that direction and that angle. Basically, in an alternate timeline where Richard Nixon actually ends up being president in the 1960 election, we already know based on what he told Kennedy he would do at the time that he would have gone in and bombed Cuba and destroyed everything, which could have very well led to the end of the world. So this little room is on the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is where I was talking, Kennedy wanted to kind of reevaluate his relationship with the Soviet Union, working on other things together. We've got some notes about that, but the big thing was the Test Ban Treaty. So the United States and the Soviet Union both agreed this whole thing had been really stupid, so they start deciding to cut down on nuclear armaments, hence the Test Ban Treaty. This is actually the pen used by Kennedy to sign it into law, which is pretty cool. They also, that's famously when they start installing the direct hotline between the United States with Washington and Moscow, because in these scenarios, you need more communication, not less. So the strategy for peace. This really affected JFK because it was like not the first time he had tasted failure. That would be like the Bay of Pigs. But this was, even though he came out on top of it, he recognized he had almost had a direct role in destroying the world, which was, not the thing you want. They have a small section kind of on Jackie Kennedy, Jackie Onassis, the woman who was basically bred to be a first lady. Like her whole family kind of teed her up for that. This was like modern day royalty. Like she and JFK were like put together for the concept of being the president and the first lady. This is an actual dress she wore. Most of the presidential libraries have a section for first ladies. Not all of them do. I was kind of expecting this one to be more robust, to be honest, because she's one of the most famous first ladies of all time. Bobby Kennedy was, of course, his brother. We talked about him a little bit. This was just kind of a recreation of The Office. He, much like his brother, much like FDR, had an affinity for boats. There's a lot of artwork of that around there. But yeah, I guess this is a recreation of his desk, probably some actual notes and things. Looks like they had a bust of FDR, which makes sense because FDR is the reason they even got into politics, because he put their dad in as an ambassador to the UK. But yeah, it's cool to see all this imagery and stuff once owned, probably at least some of it, by the late Bobby Kennedy. Yeah, Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General of the United States under the Kennedy administration, which was seen somewhat as like, biased, that Kennedy was employing his own family to do these major government roles, but he was actually very good at the job. He actually started investigating one of the mobsters that his own father had ties to, which is why they actually had to kick their dad out of any involvement of anything. That should tell you a lot. Also, he had the awkward duty that once the assassination happened and Lyndon Johnson had to be sworn in as president, he had to be sworn in by Bobby Kennedy. His own brother had to swear him in, which was awkward because he hated Lyndon Johnson. So here they have a recreation of the Oval Office, as a lot of presidential libraries do. This one is strange because it's only like half of it. They have the Resolute desk, and there's some famous photos actually. Oh, there it is actually. That wasn't a bit. I really didn't notice that until just now. This exact photo is him basically at his desk playing with his kids. Apparently most mornings he would get up, hang out with Carolyn Kennedy, who is still alive, and John Kennedy Jr., who famously died in the 90s in a plane crash. He would get together with them and have Cheerios and watch Saturday morning cartoons and things like that. Really loved his kids. He was a good father. He had another son, Patrick Kennedy, but famously he only lasted a couple of days before he died shortly after birth. But yeah, this section isn't just his Resolute desk. He was also big into ships. He went to Warm Springs, Georgia once, which is like FDR's little White House. And FDR was super into ships, so they had that in common, even though they never met. But when he goes to FDR's little White House, he sees this one type of ship up on the wall, and he says, "Oh, I need to have that. Where did that come from?" And he finds the Italian guy who made it. That said Italian guy makes one for him, but it's not finished until after the assassination, so he never got to enjoy it. But yeah, Kennedy loves ships. But the point I was about to make is, you see Martin Luther King there. This section is more on Kennedy and civil rights. Kennedy was a proponent of civil rights eventually. He was never against it. It just wasn't really on his priorities list. But he eventually recognizes it's the right thing to do. It has to be done. However, he doesn't have the political capital to get it done. We don't know what would have happened if he had lived. But I can tell you it did technically get completed in his administration. Lyndon Johnson, after he takes over when Kennedy is assassinated, he has the political clout. The country is willing to kind of do whatever they need to for the late president. And Lyndon Johnson gets the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964, mostly through the death of John F. Kennedy and the overwhelming sorrow that the country felt. It was the necessary thing to do. It was the correct thing to do. And it flipped the South, as Lyndon Johnson said, for a generation. And as it turns out, probably more than that. So here they have got more artwork of the Kennedys. Jackie Kennedy once wore this dress. Now, we didn't really talk about it too much over there. I'm surprised how lackluster that room is for Jackie Kennedy, one of the most posh type of first ladies we ever had. She actually famously redesigned the entire White House. She wanted to redo a lot of it. She had actually once commented that the Eisenhowers, like the way they had it designed was just so drab and boring. And she's like, this is America's house. This is supposed to be an amazing representation of the country. So she decided to doll it up and make it fancier and everything. They even have, like, she went on national television once. This might actually be what they're airing, where she just kind of showed the country, like, this is the people's house. This isn't a special house for royalty, even though that it's American royalty, but not literally. I don't know. She was very transformative first lady. She was very, very popular, probably the most popular person in the country. So much so that when the Kennedys actually did a trip to Europe, I think it might have been Paris. They went to Paris. JFK joked with the press that I'm the man who's just here to escort the famous Jackie Kennedy around Paris. She was so much more popular than he was. Looks like she won the Academy of Television and Sciences produced a special Emmy Award for the First Lady. Oh, okay. So Jackie Kennedy won an Emmy. I did not know that. It was probably for this, actually. Apparently, there was a flood in the Nile River in 1961, and the Kennedy administration, particularly with Jackie's initiative, got funding together to rescue a bunch of these artifacts. So a lot of this stuff only survived because of the Kennedys. That's one of those cool things you just don't know. I mean, like, that one was totally, I didn't know. Of course, we just talked about the boating, and obviously the Kennedys have a big family. Ted Kennedy, of course, would live all the way until 2009 as a senator. So he never became president, mostly because of the Chappaquiddick thing, but anyway, that's a different story. More just artifacts and things they had. What else have we got? So here's more on Jackie Kennedy. Oh, okay, finally. See, they show a little bit more about her. One of the most famous first ladies of all time. Lots of photos, artifacts and things she was into, gifts she received, outfits she had. It would have been weird if they didn't have more on Jackie Kennedy, so I'm really glad this is here. So here they have Kennedy's dictaphone, which you can actually hear the audio of. It's playing above us, but that's actually it. He would record stuff. He actually recorded this in November of 1963, only honestly, a couple weeks before the assassination. And he's largely talking about Vietnam. I'm not going to do the whole thing on Vietnam because that wasn't really his war. But basically, in the Eisenhower years, the northern part of the country had basically flipped communist. The southern part hadn't. The United States wasn't too keen to intervene just because they remembered the Korean War. And Kennedy, having kind of been burned out on Bay of Pigs and all the issues with the Cuban Missile Crisis and wanting better relations with the Soviet Union, he didn't want to throw the United States into Vietnam. So the popular consensus is that he probably never would have done it. Eventually, Lyndon Johnson, he changed that, but we'll save that for the Johnson Library. There is still the debate eternally whether or not JFK would have ever put troops on the ground and fought in Vietnam. I personally think he would not have. So in, I think it's June of 1963, he takes a trip out to Europe. He hits up Ireland, his ancestral home. He does a trip to the UK. He goes to Paris, as he made that joke about before that I talked about. But famously, he goes to Berlin. Now, Berlin, he goes to the Brandenburg Gate, and he goes to the Berlin Wall. And that's the first time he sees the disparity that is Berlin and the concept of being on the east and the west side of the wall. And it changes him. And he basically says, like, yeah, the Soviet Union is a bad thing. Their way of life is terrible. It's very oppressive, etc. And he basically invites everybody to, like, come out. If you don't understand why the United States has to be present in Europe, why the geopolitics of America not going back to isolationism, which was still kind of an afterthought at that point in the country, if you don't understand why the United States needs to be there, go to Berlin. You will see firsthand why the United States must remain. Because we cannot allow that way of life, or not obviously the Irish, I'm just pointing at that because that's what's in front of me, but referring to the Soviet Union, we cannot allow that to endure because it's oppressive and terrible. That was basically the mentality he walked away with. That's a whole section is on the state visit to Europe from June to July of 1963. And they have photos of that. This is from the famous Berlin speech. Ich bin ein Berliner. That whole thing. It's probably the line everybody can quote. But he's up on these things, as you can see there, and he sees the wall and the Soviet guards on the other side, and it's just like, that is repugnant. The western side is modern and everything, and the other side is drab and just looks bombed out and terrible. Why would anybody want to live like that? But yeah, that was his trip. Did you ever have a nice European trip where you learned about the evils of communism?
I was never in Europe before.
You could have also said because communism has fallen before you were even born. He's really young, guys. He's really young. This dude is so young that, what did you just tell me?
I told him that I was born a month before 9/11 at least. So, but he was 3 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. So Two. Okay, so even younger, which means you were there, but
a month before 9/11. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
So we knew it had to happen. November 22nd, 1963. Now here's the thing, guys. I'm going to truncate this a lot because I did a very deep dive video into the Kennedy assassination. You can watch that whole thing. But here in short is what happens. JFK has to go down to do what they call the Texas two-step, where he's basically down there for political stumping. He goes down to Houston, he goes to Dallas, he goes to San Antonio. In Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, at about noon, he's in his motorcade driving through Dealey Plaza when what is generally considered the final consensus of actions is that Lee Harvey Oswald basically opened fire on him, happened to hit him, and he happened to get hit in the head and died. It's vastly more complex and complicated than that. But like I said, I did a whole video on that. I visit every single site. Go watch that. And I know the audio got weird because we're in this like bubbly thing. Here, they basically talk about how the world reacted to the death of JFK, which is memorials. There's a mountain named after him in Canada. They actually had shown right there. I've been there, actually. That's the memorial in the UK. That's actually in Runnymede. That is actually sovereign U.S. soil the Queen of England gave to us. In fact, let's show it to you right now. Yeah, as far as the library is concerned, they clearly don't want to talk about this too much, so I will stress again, go watch. I did a separate video entirely on the Kennedy assassination. Watch that, the whole story. It's like 48 minutes long, visiting all the locations, talking about everything. All you really need to know, though, is that Kennedy does die at about 1:16 p.m. or so at Parkland Hospital, and Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One. Kennedy's body is taken back to D.C. He is given a state funeral a couple days later. He and Lee Harvey Oswald are buried at about exactly the same time as Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by a man named Jack Ruby. One, is JFK. He's got the Eternal Flame grave down in Arlington Cemetery in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., while Oswald has just some cheap pauper's grave, and deservedly so, because he was kind of a piece of So when you leave the section that's about some of the memorials named after JFK around the world, they have this section on just kind of the legacy of the Kennedy White House. Keep in mind, the Kennedy White House was short. It was only around for 2.5 years. Camelot, as they once called it, fell. And yeah, the legacy of him is things like the Space Initiative. Kennedy Space Center is named after him. Obviously, they eventually achieved the moon landing. Bobby Kennedy almost becomes president, but is himself assassinated in the 1968 election, which would lead to the Richard Nixon administration. His other brother, Ted Kennedy, attempts a run against Jimmy Carter in 1980, loses, and then the whole Chappaquiddick incident basically prevents Ted Kennedy from ever becoming president. A bunch of his relatives kind of live on in his memory and talk about other things that he has done. His daughter is still around. As I mentioned before, his son, John Kennedy Jr., did unfortunately pass away in the 90s due to a plane crash. The enduring concept of the Peace Corps is still around because of him and the influence that it spreads trying to get that initiative out there. Yeah, in many ways, the Kennedy administration is one of the most iconic ones in American history, despite how short it actually was. And a lot of his goals were eventually achieved. Berlin, he was not around for it, but Berlin did eventually reunify. Berlin Wall fell, which is in of itself is a crazy story, by the way, but we'll tell that another time. But Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union falls, and like a lot of the presidential libraries, they have a chunk of the Berlin Wall right here. So as a fun little bonus, Kennedy also invented the Situation Room, something his library doesn't mention for whatever reason, but the one you're seeing here is actually the leftovers of the real Situation Room in the George W. Bush Library in Dallas, Texas. So the Resolute desk you're seeing here is, fun fact, Kennedy was actually the first president to use it. That Oval Office Resolute desk had been around for years, but he was the first one who really liked it because Jackie Kennedy found it and said we should use this, and it's been kind of a gold standard of presidents ever since.
While Adam was just talking about everything, I'm just looking at a rock right here, and I'm like, ooh, wow, it's a moon rock, and it looks like a piece of a sidewalk, but it's still cool.
Okay, so it's a chunk of the moon is here. That's nice. Well, that makes sense. They have something about an artificial valve for heart, which is technology that came out of NASA. As I mentioned earlier, the space race wasn't just about one-upping the Soviets. It was also about the technological pressure that you can put on society by making all these changes and new things come of it. That's also why they mentioned smartphones there. That was born of the space race, that technology. Never forget, Kennedy putting so much effort and material into that led to modern day technology well beyond his presidency. So when you come out of that whole area, you'll end up out here. Very nice view, actually, as we mentioned before. There's Boston is right over there. And then you'll see planes flying overhead. Then they have more floors upstairs. They have a giant flag. He was actually just asking me, he's like, I thought you said this was a library. I was expecting a library. So the presidential libraries are museums and libraries. So the part we saw was the museum. Up there, exactly. The books and stuff are probably up there. The libraries are for like researchers. I've shown you guys some of these at like the Eisenhower Library, its own separate building, etc. You have to be like a legitimate researcher looking, like Kennedy's actual notes from his presidency would be up there. At least I'm assuming in that case. I don't know exactly where they are, but I don't know where else you would put it because this museum has been mostly on the first and second floor. But yeah, I like this one. I like the design of this one. It actually, when you look at it from outside, it actually very much looks like almost like a NASA building, like something they would have launched a shuttle out of, which makes perfect sense given the history of it. So when you come up from that area, you'll see security and all that stuff again. Interestingly, this one has a restaurant, the JFK Cafe. Not all of them do this. I know that FDR's did. There's just a quick look at it. That's the only thing that's labeled John F. Kennedy ice cream, I guess. But it's not, it's just regular stuff. But yeah, it just kind of reminds me of like an airport lounge with pictures of Kennedy everywhere. Nice view, though. So this is a little section called Staff Picks from the Archives. So one thing that when you come to these libraries and museums, there's tons of stuff they have that they can't display. So they'll rotate stuff. This one's cool because I've never seen this on any of the other ones. Staff Picks. I guess they can go through and find some of their favorite images or whatever and post them publicly in cycling here. So this is some of the stuff that people liked. And you knew it had to happen. The museum gift shop. I like the idea of a John F. Kennedy flask and sort of the Kennedy imagery taken as like that Obama hope image, that presidential jacket. That's actually really cool. Now, one thing I might buy would be like, a Marilyn Monroe action figure, but something tells me that's not going to be her because they don't mention her at all. Postcards, and I like the presidential jackets. I really do. I'm going to look around and see if I see anything else that's kind of neat. That's not so neat. I hate hand egg. So kind of generally, they have a lot of Kennedy 35. Everything's 35 because he was the 35th president of the United States. They have a lot on the PT 109. I like some of the outfits. Nothing I would ever really wear or anything like that. I misread this from a distance as students hot for Kennedy, and I was like, oh, but then I remember, he was kind of a womanizer in his youth, but whatever. So we have just left the John F. Kennedy Library. What did you think?
So, very minimalistic approach from the outside as well as the inside, but I quite liked it myself. Really straightforward too, and basically, I learned a lot today.
Well, thank you for bringing me out here. I appreciate you doing that.
No problem.
Yeah. So I'm going to give my take on this. As far as Presidential Library goes, this is not my favorite one. It was an odd layout, and I feel like, here's the thing with this one. There's so many iconic events in the JFK experience. They barely mention the Bay of Pigs. Cuban Missile Crisis is truncated to a tiny room where they just like watch a movie. We don't want to explain it. The assassination is like, oh yeah, by the way, he was shot. That was odd. And I will say this, one of my favorite things about some of the other presidential libraries is they don't hide the bad stuff. Like, here's the bad things Truman did, here's the bad things Eisenhower did, or whatever. They don't mention the Marilyn Monroe stuff, they don't mention the womanizing, this is very whitewashed image of JFK. It's not bad, go to it. Just keep in mind, it's trying to make you think something like halfway there, if that makes any sense. As a little bonus, though, they have this harbor walk and JFK's sailboat. We're going to go scope that out. I will say in defense of this one, though, I do like the harbor view. I love the fact that it's actually in a major city. It makes it very accessible. It's only like 20 minutes from the airport, which is super nice. These are big positives. I feel like the museum itself can do a little bit more to actually flush out his presidency and actually talk about it more. It's not a bad thing to talk about all of the things that happened in his administration, good and bad. It is okay. That's the whole point. You're trying to teach people so they learn from history. That's the whole point. We have confirmation. This actually was JFK's boat. Nice bonus. Speaking of bonuses, though, let's show you some. The first of many bonuses. This is Harvard University, where John F. Kennedy, of course, went to school. I don't know if you went to any one of these specific buildings, but here we are in Harvard University, which is, of course, just outside of Boston in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just want to point this out. JFK, who is on the rarely used 50-cent half dollar, is the last American president ever put on American currency, at least at the time of this video. This is the limousine that the president rode in on that horrible day on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. It is worth mentioning that we are at the Ford Museum in Detroit, Michigan, and the reason that the vehicle is here is because back in the day, the car was not actually owned by the White House, rather it was leased to it. So once the lease expired, it had to be returned. It's a whole long, convoluted story, but yeah, you can see this for yourself anytime you want by going out to Detroit, Michigan. This is the Air Force One used by President Kennedy during his term in office. This color design that you see here was designed by Jackie Kennedy and is still used today. However, this is famously the one that took him to Dallas, Texas, and his body away from Dallas, Texas. It is viewable to the public today in Dayton, Ohio. This is the final resting place of President John F. Kennedy. The eternal flame is meant to burn on and represent the hopes and dreams he attempted to bring to the nation. So that's everything there. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned to the next episode, which will be on...
Who?
Lyndon Johnson. He learned nothing in here. It's depressing. But anyway, yes, we'll be talking about Lyndon Johnson down in Austin, Texas. So thank you guys very much for watching. Please, if you can, do me a favor, like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before. Check out all the social media stuff in the description. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, which is this. So appreciate you continuing to watch that. Go watch the main channel too. There's video games and stuff over there. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all later.